So there is one very important thing that we miss talking on the base of React, which is state. Now, props, as we saw, is something that we give to the component, but we cannot change, like on the go, right? Like when you look at this page, now is open somewhere here, right? I cannot change my age by interacting with the website, right? In order to change it, I need to go here on purpose and change it. And then eventually it gets changed here. So props are very static things. It's things you give to a component so it starts. Like you start with this exact prop. For instance, the example we looked in GitHub. Oh, maybe not the React one. The example we looked here. Now, name can easily, okay, this might be a bit tricky, but if we go to the component itself, this can be a prop because it is something that in order for the owners to change, they need to go to settings, change the name, and save. So then technically that goes to the database, then the response comes back, and then the page gets rendered with that name. So that's a prop. But this star here, I do it, change to 28. I do it again, change to 29. This is not a prop, or should not be a prop. This is a state of this whole place that, depending on my click here, should either go up or down. And you kind of did that before when you add an event listener and say like, oh, or when you on a button, on click, do this, on click, do that. That's the most common example of state, and that's the one I'm going to use probably. And now, one of the big differences, it used to be 2 years ago on React between functional components and class components, is that you could not use state on function components. You could not. So if your component needs state, you have to use a class component. And that used to be the rule. Right now, it's no longer the rule. You can use state on functional components. That's why these ones are a bit out of the market, because that was the only reason why you use them. And now we can do it here. And this one is simpler, is less code, it's not so crazy, and it's function. And functions are a bit easier to handle and test and everything. So let's not use this anymore. But because again, the documentation on Hack Your Future shows class components, I will give an example of how things work here. I'll just change this a little bit so that it's a bit cleaner. So this is a class component, and I leave answer. Yeah, okay. Now I will create new components to show that, because these ones only have props, basically. So if we have a class component, my state class component extends now render return a div with a button, maybe saying click me. Right. Now we need to use this somewhere, and I'm gonna put on the top one is so that I'm gonna close these ones because we won't need to look at them anymore for now, and I'm just gonna put it here so that we have a reference point to it. So as you can see now, there is a button there. Just for the sake of it, I'm gonna use HR here so that we divide it a little bit. And this is a button, but this doesn't do anything, right? Because it's just an HTML button, does nothing. Now this So const title equals this dot props dot title. And now I will actually I'll remove the click me so that we show both state and props in the same component, because that's possible. It's not that you can either use state or props. So what did I call it? Title, I think. Click me. So this is no different what it was before. So we have this component. We are sending a title with the value click me, and then all the way down here we are using this title as title, and then we are putting it inside of the button, and that's basically what's being rendered here. So if now we look at our application here and we inspect this, this is just a simple div with a button inside, and that's exactly what we wrote here. So now we want to say you clicked, right? We want to count how many times someone clicked. Times, just to make it a bit more confusing of where we have stuff. So this part comes you clicked, and here comes times. So we need something here to tell us how many times did a person click. Now for that comes a very weird thing. That's also why people are giving up of this. Is a lot of code to write. That is called constructor, and yeah, it hasn't been initialized because a constructor always needs a super, not supper, because that's a completely different thing. And you always need to send the props back to the parent, because that's basically what the constructor, what this super does is that sends it whatever the parent needs, it sends it to it. So this always needs to happen, otherwise your props will all get messed up. You cannot access to them, and actually if you forget, it will say no, we cannot do this. And again, this is not needed to use props, because as you see on the other component, we didn't add any construct. But to use state, we need, because we need to tell the initial value of the state, because we want to say you clicked count many times. For instance, we want a variable called count here. This variable does not exist, of course, so const count equals 0. So we want to update this value here. And by doing this, doesn't really work. What we can do is, again, on this word, there is a state object where we can give anything to it. Count 0, right? And I mean, we can give more. It's an object, so we can give whatever we want to it. It doesn't have to be one per each. So now we can actually kill this count here, and now down here we can say this dot state dot count, and now the 0 is there. So if we put 2, there is a 2 being rendered there. But again, this is the initial value of it. Now we want to say whenever I click here, does the count plus 1, so that we can count up. So for that, we need an event on a button. Now the good part is that the button has, I actually don't know if we can see it here. No, we can't, but it has a on click event, right? And this is a function. So there is, we can use an arrow function on it, and we can console log you clicked, right? So now if we, come on, okay, yeah. So if we open this and we clicked, now we can see that it logs every time we click. Again, this is not that new. We've done this before. Now what we want to do is to update this value here. And you could think that we would do this dot state dot count equals count plus 1. We cannot do that. We cannot, I mean, if you do, I think some versions of React actually allows you to do it, but that's really, really wrong to do it. The new version should not even allow you to do it. So on this, there is also a function that you can call that actually that's the one that has been appearing a lot of times, which is called setState, where you can set the state. That's basically what it says. So it still takes an object, and then you can say that the count is this dot state dot count plus 1. We save this, and now every time we count, it's increasing the number. Let me just maybe put this in different lines, so it might be a little bit easier to read. I just cannot save it, otherwise it will format it for us. So basically, in here, what is this readable? Yeah. So when our component mounts, and that's also those life cycles that I showed, like when the function component did mount does, it not when it mounts, but when it starts, we say, oh, by the way, on the state, I want the variable count with a value 0. So it always starts at 0. And if we refresh the website, it will go to 0. That's basically exactly what it does. Like it's a brand new component. So it does to 0. But now on click, I want to set the state of the value count. That's because this is an object inside, is exactly the same object as here. And I want to set it as whatever the current value of the state is plus 1. So when you click, this triggers 1, the state gets updated to 1. Then when you click again, then whatever value is on the state, which in this case is 1, plus 1 goes to 2, 3, and so on.
So who holds the value of that state?
The component. The component itself. And that's exactly why we do this, so that we started with something. We need to always start the state with something. Because again, if we, and now when I saved, it did. When I refresh, it goes to 0 because the component restarted again. So now when we say component did mount, state, we can maybe just do this. Did update, I think. Sure. So now we can see what is happening here on these life cycles. And you can see that the state, and in here we are just printing it, and mount only got printed once, right? Because it only mounts once. We are not telling it to force update, and that's another thing. So if we do this dot state dot count equals 3, can we write force update? Is this valid? Probably it is. Okay. And this gave an error because now we are trying to update something, and then the component just it's basically saying, nope, stop. What you're doing is really, really wrong, because you cannot force me to update the whole component just because you want. And this is something it will, maybe I should just stop and refresh, otherwise the browser can go crazy. Yeah. This is something that can happen if you have a lot of components inside each other. And for instance, you update the state on this one, and then you tell this one to update itself, then it tries to update the whole children. Because if it has any children, it will just re-render everything. And that's a very heavy job for the browser to do. Even though React is fast, everything is fast, but you can make it slow if you do bad code. Yeah, if you do a little bit of bad code, you can make it really, really slow. Because again, it always depends on what you're doing. And there is a lot of standards of what to do and what not to do. But again, using component did mount, component did update, and class components is no longer what we do. I'll remove these things from here. And now I will try to recreate this in a functional component. So I will just start writing it. My state functional component, and it returns exactly div with a button, and we'll do exactly the same thing. That will get a title, and I'll even copy this thing, but this now does not exist. Okay, now if we go all the way up here, just again, this is not needed, it's just so that we have everything in one place for the sake of it, and give a title. I'll give exactly the same title. So now we have two buttons. This one is class, and this one is functional. It's just so that we see it recreated here. Now, to use state in a functional component, we use something called hooks and React hooks. If you search anything about React recently on, or for the past few years, maybe 2 years or something, everybody talks about hooks because it was something new. Like a lot of people that already had websites with React, they had to, or they didn't had to, but they refactored the whole thing to use hooks because it was new and people like, wow, this is amazing. And it is, it looks magic, but it's not. You can actually see what happens inside of a hook. It's actually quite, not that simple, but easy to understand. So, and as you can see here, it was only since the 16.8 version, or 16.7 already had it, but as an experiment only or something like that. And basically, a hook always starts with use. That's, so for instance, in here you say use state. And that does exactly what it means. It uses the state. Like it is very simple for that. So the way to rewrite this whole thing would just be to say use state, but the use state function, are we importing? Yeah, and as you can see, it will import here. You have to import if your if VS Code doesn't import automatically, you'll have to do it. Otherwise, there is an error. And the use state returns two things. Returns the value, the initial value, like the same thing that we did here, and returns a function to update that value. What we are seeing here, set state. The good part is that we can give names to that. We can give whatever name to that. So, and it returns as a, it looks like an array, but it's not. It's two values. So now here, I actually need to give an initial value. This is just because it was assigned. Because, okay, if I give the initial value 1, you can see up there that actually it got, the count got this value. And the set count will be a function to update the count. But again, this, we name this. This is not given by React. We can put, we can say like increment count. We can give whatever name we want to any of them. And this gives you a lot of freedom to actually name your things the correct way, and you don't use a set state thing. Because a set state, you'll have to update the, like, if you have a lot of values here, let's say we also have name as a string or whatever. Probably we need this here and we need this here. Then whenever you put set state, you really need to specify, otherwise you will update the whole thing and you don't need that. So, but we will just call it set count. And the way that it will work is very similar to what we did up here. So we have an on-click event, right? That it is function. And now we can use the set count to count plus 1. And maybe this should start at 0, right? And it does exactly the same as that. And it's almost half of the code that you had to do exactly there is no absolutely, I mean, there is differences, as you can see, but in terms of logic, in terms of what we are trying to achieve, it's cleaner code, and it's a bit shorter, it's a bit easier to change, because if you want to change here, then you have to change there, you have to change there. In here, again, we have a little bit more control, and you can use as many use states as you want. In here, you basically have to define all your state in the component. So, for instance, let's say we have, of course, you need to name them differently, otherwise it will complain. Span. So, okay, that's stupid. So for instance, now this name, and now we want to change the name also when we click on a button, just because. So of course, in here we are assigning the arrow function to a function. So if we want to do something, we need to do this, right? And now we can say set name to now, because the name is already that one. I mean, it is trying to set it again, of course, but it is the same, so we won't see the updates. Mm-hmm. So again, you can use as many chunks of state as you need. You can always send an object here instead of instead of a unit value. You can always say that you want count 0, but now it's going to be weird because it's going to be count.count. But this is valid as well. But then, of course, when you set count, you need to set the whole object when you try to do. So count.count. Is it there? Yeah. And okay, that one went away because we are setting the wrong thing. Oops. Yeah, we're back. Count is this, and name. Oh, yeah, that will conflict. Count equals count.count plus 1. No, isn't it? It should be. Okay, let's count.name. Yeah. You can, again, you can send an object a state, but then whenever you set like whatever function you called here, because you are the owner of the name of this, then you need to send the same structure of an object to update it. So I will go all the way back because I would suggest to do it a bit more. Each one of them should have their own responsibility. If, again, of course, if you have a count and a total, like things that make sense together, then it should be there. If not, make them separate, because you can have, again, you should not have more than 10. That would be weird if you have a component that big, but you can have as many as you want. So yes, that's the reason why we are not using this. Again, there's nothing wrong if you want to use it. It's a class, it's a complete valid thing in JavaScript. It's just that in future versions, I might be lying, but I would think that they might want to get rid of this thing eventually in React, or at least the support for it. in future versions, but in long-term future, because this only came out some versions ago, because it came out on version 16.8 and we are already on 16.12. So I would think if we go to version 17, this might not be there anymore. I don't know. But yeah, I would suggest you, whenever you get the task to do that you need some state on your component, I would suggest to even try both, because again, they are completely valid if you want. It's just that I think it's way easier to use. And now, what I just said, if you think you need state, and that's, again, it's your, from what I read in homework and whatever, it won't really tell you create something that uses state or whatever. You'll have to figure out that on your own, or of course you can ask for help. Because again, that's a very good thing to exercise also in your head of what it's the difference between having state and having props. And and as I told you, if me, the user, because now I am the user, I'm looking at the website, when I interact with the website, something has to change, that's state. If when I load the website, like the website just loaded, and some stuff is dynamic but does not change with my interaction, then those are props. That would be the way to, at least that I would explain what's the difference between using state or not. So of course, if I want to change this, then I need to have something that changes, like an input field or like a button. Like for instance, the name here is changing. So this is state. But I don't want to change this or this, so it's a prop. So that is the states part. And of course, in the Hacky Feature documentation, it will say that the initialization is in a constructor, because this is referencing the old way of doing it as a class component. So if you go through all the examples that they have here, everything uses class components for state. So that would even be, if you have a lot of free time, a good exercise to actually transform these ones into function components and do exactly the same job. Then, I mean, again, a lot of people out there in real jobs had to do that, because everyone was like, let's use hooks instead of class components. So they had to basically, they didn't change anything except the structure of their components. A lot of people did that. So that's some nice exercise to do.
React
Yes.
is also a SPA, single page application?
Yes. Yeah.
Ah, okay.
Actually, that's basically what we will build in the last class, I think. I'm not sure if that's exactly what we will build, but something like that.
What is SPA?
A single page application.
Single page application?
Yes. Even though, and that's a very tricky thing. Everything is a single page application nowadays, as well as like everything is an application. Everything is a single page application or not. Because by single page, it means that you don't go anywhere else, like no slash something. Everything is in one page. But you can do those slash something, like I think on Express, you guys learn the routing.
Yeah.
React has their own routing
Okay.
that you can route to other pages in React as well. But everything is client side, nothing is server side. Express, everything is server side. I think. I never really used Express. But you define the routes on a server. So when a server starts, the server knows exactly what routes there are. On a single page application, it does not know until the JavaScript kicks in. Because again, as I showed you a lot of times, there is no HTML here. Like inside of this root, there is nothing here. But it has to come from somewhere. It's not magic, right? So there is all these JavaScript things, and like you remember when we learned HTML and the beginning of JavaScript, you had to insert this by hand. You won't do that anymore. React will do it for you. And they all will have these weird names, and they all will have this weird JavaScript code that it's unreadable, and it's on purpose. It's minimized so to be as fast as possible, to be as light as possible to download. And that's why sometimes if you're using your phone on a train, sometimes the websites look completely different once the internet really comes in, because it means that the JavaScript just came in and now there is stuff to show. And there is a way to actually see that. That's a fun thing to see in a lot of websites. If you disable JavaScript, because you can do that in some browsers, and I refresh this, there is no website. Because there is no JavaScript running. We told the browser to say, no JavaScript here. I don't want JavaScript. If you do this in half of the websites out there, they won't run. Because
Just by Facebook, how does it look like?
they will, because they server-side rendered everything. That's exactly the same that happens, for instance, on GitHub, or on even in here. If we do that here, all the way down here, disable JavaScript. As you can see, the style went away. Like, none of this is working now. Probably if we click, oh yeah, the click is there because it's an HTML page. But some of the clicks will not work in some websites because they are all handled by React Router. So, and React is not there because, well, you disable JavaScript and React needs JavaScript to run.
Are
but-
React also asyncs?
The life cycles of the components is exactly to do async things,
yeah.
because that's basically what they are doing. They are saying whenever the component mounts, then do this. That's an async functionality. And on next class, we will talk about more, I'm going to say both hooks and life cycles, because life cycle is for class component and hooks is for function component. We will do those exercises where, for instance, in order to fetch data from an API, you should not break the website. For instance, imagine your server part, your Node.js server is very slow. You don't want your React app to be slow. But it's okay for the server to be slow because the React app will load, and then asynchronous will say like, oh, whenever the data comes, let me know, and then I'll print things out. And that's basically what the life cycles do that handle all that asynchronously thing. And that's it's not really exactly, but you can imagine that the word React actually comes from reactive, which comes a little bit from the asynchronous, which is if something happens, I will react. That's basically what it means. But again, if you search is React reactive, you'll find like the biggest discussions of the internet right now. Like people go crazy about that thing because it is a big subject to talk about.
Why do they ask Mark? Mark Zuckerberg.
Oh, he didn't build it, actually.
But-
He never touched on it. He doesn't know about it. There is this person. He's the React guy, Dan Abramov. He's like a
Overreactive.
small genius person or a big genius, but I don't know. He's a genius person. And he makes a lot of talks about React and stuff like that. Okay, now we talked about props, we talked about state, JSX, components, and now my idea would be to build something while we are here, and then you guys will build something very similar or similar-ish as part of homework. Actually, I will not do what you guys have to do on the homework, but I will do something a little bit different. But again, I will do it here on this code sandbox that you guys can use as well to do this, but I would suggest you to follow the homework where you actually have to install something on your machine with the npm, but all the stuff is explicit there. So now I will create a new file, and I'll call git home because .js. Okay, so now we'll need React again from React.
Will you be teaching us React Router next week?
I don't think it's next week.
It's not next week.
I don't think so. Then because it's almost at the end, I think, the router part.
Is there a convention for the capital case and the camel case, or for this?
I mean, this one has to be capital because that's how it's defined.
No, I'm saying on the files, because now you see you put like Git Home and app that has like a capital case. Is there a convention to that, or?
Kinda. You will see that most of the components that you will see out there are capital. And actually, I think we can actually try, because I remember at some point I wrote something with everything lowercase, and there was some sort of error, not error, but a warning saying that I should write them capital. But actually, we can try that now.
Because I think the
Not
class
expect.
name should be by Pascal.
No,
Yeah, the class,
The class.
yes, but the functional, not necessarily. Const git whoop, home, and now we will create. Oh, we need to return. Because now we will use local data to actually print out something. Because again, all the components we build right now is just like one component has this, one component has that. Now we will try to put components together in a easier or better way, not easier. Page one. So welcome to Git home. So now what I'll do here is that I'm going to the index, the one that I showed you before, and I'm just going to replace the app with the one I'm creating, so that it will basically replace the whole application. From and I want to import git home, right. So now if I do this, but isn't there git home there? No. Yeah, okay, better. I will also import the styles so that at least we have a nice. Actually, I'll import the styles here. Again, the imports, you can write them almost anywhere, especially the CSS imports, because you're not really attaching it to anything. You just want it to be there somewhere. So in here, I'm just moving it here, so now I can use it everywhere across my components all the way from here down.
Because you imported, I mean, you just commented out, but because you imported the Git Home after the app, it's just kind of like
no.
overwrote or
No.
overtook?
No.
Or,
It's just I replaced it here as well.
okay.
It's just that this one,
the rendering, yeah.
this one probably, yeah, is telling us that it's the declare, but it's not being used.
Okay.
And again, this is just a warning. This is not an error.
The rendering,
Yeah.
whatever you're rendering is what's coming up.
So now we are looking at this one here. And
You cannot use two files in the same index.
two files, for instance, joining this and this.
Yes.
No, because in here, this should be one component. For instance, and that's.
See, he's rendering that on the root element, and the root element is the one that actually is going to run the whole page.
But for instance, we can do this. I wouldn't agree with it, but
Agree with what?
with what I'm about to do. And then we can say git home. Oh. And app here. Now we are rendering both. The main idea here is that this React.render accepts one component, only one component. So we either send git home or app, or I mean, if we want both, then we need to make those both become one. And by doing that is to put them inside one component. even though, as you saw before, this means nothing, right? This means like just render this. There is no wrapper, there is no divs, there is nothing. But this is completely valid to do.
Because Marco, how we learned before the JavaScript from teachers, and you say for us like when you want to build a program or something like that, you should divide it in 2 files or 3 files, and then.
Yes.
But how I can do that here?
You can do it by creating one main. In here, we created everything in the app file, right?
Okay.
But what we did is also wrong, because when you go here, all these components are on this file,
Yeah.
right? They should all be on their own files. So basically, we would have a index.js that renders an app.js, and the app should be the culmination of everything. So,
Yeah.
like what we did here, it was just to make it easier to write the components here. But now for the new one I'm about to do, we will separate concerns into different files. So like
And then-
our real app should be.
And then you import it in the app,
Yes.
and the app will write to the index.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Because again, of course, as each component should have their responsibility, they should also be on their own file. Because as you can see here, it's already a bit crazy to go through the whole list, and it's not a lot of components we have here. It's a very
easy to
simple
change
page.
as well, because if you need to change one component on a
Yeah,
page,
you change in one file
you
only.
want your own file only.
But now we can.
And if there's a problem with the page somewhere, you know where the problem comes from because you changed one file.
Yeah, but now we can ignore the app.js because that was just to explain the basic of React. So now what we care about is this Git home. Now, again, on your source folder, and that comes with time and ideas and whatever, you can have as many folders as you want. And like, of course, it depends how you want to structure and organize your code. So now I created a folder called components, and then inside I'll have a header.js. Now this, as I told you before, we'll write the word React, import React from React a lot. And export.
That has to be in every single file.
If you want to use React, yes. This is the same with everything. If you want to use Express, you have to import it before using it. You cannot pass it down as a property. That would be a bit crazy.
That would be cool, actually.
So now we'll create a very simple header with a div. So again, our our index.js loads Git home as a main component. So I'll close this one. Now this one, we actually want to load the header first instead of writing things here. So we can just go ahead and write header. And again, usually by writing on VS Code and on this tool, it tries to find, do I know a component with the name header? And if it does, it actually imports it automatically. So we can control click and go there, and then we can change to name, just to have some props. So now the base one is doing this. I will just give a class name to this. Which one was it? App. Okay. Looks better. And again, because we are importing the styles here, now the styles are available everywhere, basically. So we can actually do something like we can define a red class that color red, or red is too aggressive, blue. And now on the header, even though we are not importing anything here, we can actually say class name equals blue, and it fetches it because the style, the CSS is in the whole HTML page. Now in here we would like to have a list of repositories, like what we saw before. Previous, is it like that? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. So now again, import React from React export const stories, and in here I'll do it as a function and as a return of div. Again, we don't always have to return a div, so we will return a list. And now we will just put a couple of them here. So we have this, but again, we just built this component, but we are not importing it anywhere. We are not using it anywhere, so we cannot really see. But eventually, you'll be able to actually write this without actually seeing it, because it becomes very, it becomes easy to write, and because it's HTML with some JavaScript, and it's, I guess, simple. But now let's render it here. What did I call it? Repositories. So it's here. Whoop. Is it there? Yeah. So we have all the stuff there. It looks beautiful. Now, as we know, we should not do this, right? We should not print things by writing it. So it would be nice to actually have the repositories in one array. So let's just put it here. Oh, we need an object, right? And then a name. And I will just put them here. No, this one. So now, how can we print this here? And again, that's where this map function comes in. So, and how, because we actually haven't seen that working. I'll just change this to a div for now so that we can do something else. Let's make a p tag. And then the UL actually comes down there, but now it's empty. So, as you've been seeing, inside of this return, we write HTML, right? As we saw on the app.js, inside of the button, we wrote HTML, and we can use this as templates as template strings. But we usually do not write JavaScript inside of HTML. We write HTML inside of JavaScript. So for instance, here, if you want to console log, yeah, this does not get executed because it's not like, the way that JSX works is like whatever is inside of here, it's HTML. If you want to use variables, if you want to use whatever you want, you need a template, the brackets around. So if we do this, if we open, as you can see, it already starts changing color. Yeah, this one will complain about things. It's because here does not exist. So now the JavaScript happened because it's inside of those. And by that, any JavaScript can happen here. So if we have a variable, I don't know how to write variable. Name. So this one gets rendered, right? Because we give it a name here.
Mm-hmm.
But and this is valid JavaScript, right? But in here, if we want to write more than one function, for instance, now we are logging this thing, but let's say we also want to log that variable, then we would have to do something like this. I think this might work. Yeah, but it doesn't get triggered. That's the problem. And there might be. Oh yeah, it's that one. So if we want to do JavaScript inside of the HTML, that becomes a little bit tricky. So all the big logic should happen outside here. But we want to print all this, not outside. We don't want to do it outside. We want to do it right here, right after this. So we can use the template strings for it. So let's do that. So here, we can do this, and now we can have repos, because in here we have access to JavaScript, and now we can map into it, and the map gives you each a function with each one of them, right? So we can do a function inside of this thing, and here is a repo. So now if we console log here repo, we have all the repos here. Now this is telling us that is not returning, because again a map should always return, but I don't know if this is a little bit confusing for any of you, but basically what we are saying is now, okay, this is JavaScript, we get here, this is JSX or HTML as you prefer, and then inside of here, because we have this as an array, we can map through it, and because now we can open a function, in here we can do whatever the hell we want with JavaScript. We cannot put, we will put HTML, but we need to write special things for HTML. For instance, if we now try to do, because now we have, oh sorry, now we have this, so we can do repo.name, right? And now we have all the names. So what we want, it's a list of repo.name, right? But for some reason, this doesn't work. Again, because we need to return something back to, because we are mapping to something and we are not returning anything. So the map basically is being ignored completely. It's being executed. That's why we can we can console log. We can do things inside of it, but the value of the map, it's not being assigned to anything. So if we return this now, and there is a big error, and it's a very good error we got, and we'll look into it, but everything works except there is an error. But it works. When you look at it here, there is a console error, and now this is also a very good error to read, because again, React usually is very good at telling you what's wrong. And it says here that each child in a list should have a unique key prop. Now, if you click, because usually there's always a link, see something, and if you click, there is like a whole explanation of what's going wrong. Like they are really good in support. Like, and sometimes people go to Google before, but the answer is right here. So basically, what's wrong here is that we are printing an li, and we are printing a lot of li's, right? And we just did that before. We actually can do it again. Li here. Oh, come on. 1, 2. And we didn't have any problem with these ones. But because we are using inside of JavaScript rendering an ally from a map, then we need to give them a key. And a key has to be a unique key per element, so that React knows exactly what goes where and who is what. Basically, it needs to know that. So in order for that, usually on a map function, you have the object that you're mapping through and the index of the array that you're mapping to as a value key. So, and this is something you will do a lot. So in here we have an index, and we know that this index is unique per element, right? Because this is 0, this is 1, this is 2. So we usually, people always use this as a key, and you can even call it whatever you want. So I would assume you should call it key, and then you put key equals key. Now if we do this, yeah, this error is something completely different. It's from the sandbox. Now there is no errors related to the key, even though you don't see it here. The key does not appear there, but React needs it to find out where does this ally actually belongs to, or something like that. Again, the explanation should be here. I don't think maybe it matters, but you should, if you are mapping and returning an element, you have to always have a key on it. So now we actually would like this not to be a list, but let's transform this into a div, and this into another div, right? Because now we also would like a description.
That actually wouldn't be able to use a list for that if you have object with the multiple entries.
We can still put things in a list. It would just look a bit horrible. I mean, we would have to have some CSS to move it around. So now we want a name, and this might be a bit too much code, but we have to do it. And repo.description. So go away, man. So now, as you can see, there is a name and a description. And now there is no errors because of the key, even though we have more elements, because the first child needs the key, and the first child is, in this case, the parent. It's this div here. So now, for instance, what we can see here is like we have a Git home that renders a header, renders a repository, and then our repositories have the list of repositories. Again, in the future, this list won't be here. This list will probably come from an API, of course, but right now we will do that here until we go to the next step. And then we are printing out this name, and this maybe should be an H2 even, instead of a P, just to make it. And then each one of them has a name and a description. Now, this handles the repositories, the list of repositories. And we can see here we have one component here, because this basically that's what the return means. It means that we have a component right here. So what we can do by looking at this, it's not needed, but we should actually move this away from here, because if we want to change, like now it's no longer an H3, it's a H4, whatever. Yes, it's very easy to come here and change it, and it will change for all of these items, but it doesn't live on itself. Like by doing something here, we might mess up the parent component, and that should not be the case. So for that, I will create a repository.js. Now here we go again. React from React export const repository, and this one. Now we can actually come here and just say return this, right? We can copy and paste. Now the problem is we need a name and a description, right? Because we don't want the list here. That's exactly why we built this one with a list. So we need to ask for that as props, because they don't change according to the end user. So in here we can just ask for a name and a description, and now we can change all these ones for a name and a description. And actually at this point here we do not need the key. That's a weird one. We don't need the key here, but we will need the key when we are still mapping through it and printing out stuff, and we will see that now. So now in here we don't need to do this. What we can do is to repository, and now we can pass name, because again in here we are still mapping, so we still have one object at a time. So now we pass repo.name, and now it should start. Yeah, there's already the name there, and description repo.description, and everything is there. Now we have an error, and the error is exactly the same we had before. There is a key missing, but the key now can go here, because again, oh sorry, key, and now it's formatted to be pretty, and there is no error anymore, because we define this as a component, this repository. We define it as a component, so it gets all the attributes that a component, that a JSX element can have. So the key, class name, all that thing, it gets it, so we can set it. So this is not only for HTML tags, but also for other components. Now we can even make this a bit more pretty, so we remove the return and just remove this. Isn't it? No. What am I doing wrong? There. Yeah, this. Okay. Yeah, it is.
No, I mean, in the future, in the real world, will come from an API, but can the array be on the repository instead of repositories?
No, because the array has many. Yeah, in this case, it would not make sense to be here. Because in here we are printing one.
Because the map function is on the other part.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What we can do, and that very possible. We can have it here. So now basically what we've done is that the repositories does not even know what the data is. Like there is no data here. The repository just saying you need to give me a list of repositories or an array of repositories, and I'll map through it, and I call a repository with that data. So this one is completely independent now. It's completely reusable. Like it does not depend on everything that depends on, you can give it to it. So it's very easy to test. It's very easy to see if it works. And I'll remove all these returns from here. Oh no, that makes it look weird. Sorry. I like it to be vertical, not horizontal. So this one is completely reusable. This one is completely reusable. Only depends on whatever data. You can actually, we can go here and do this. we can do this, and it gets printed right there with the same exact style, same exact structure, same exact everything. If you go to the overview, it created an extra div because it's not inside of the repositories. It's being, I'll close this one. It's being printed after the repositories. So because of that, of course, it created its own div, because this one is a div with a lot of divs.
Marco, how would you know what goes inside the app.js and what goes inside the index.js?
Yeah, that's something that happens by magic when you start a React app by the commands. But the way you know basically is this: on your package.json, your main needs to point for the single, like the main point of your application. And I think if you create an Express app and you want to deploy it, that also needs to happen. I think when it runs on your machine, if it's not really pointing, your machine still figures it out.
It's like the point of entry.
Yeah.
I mean, what are the codes that should be inside the index, and what code should be inside the app.js?
Actually, for that there is no rule. Like, again, you can have the whole code, all of it here on the index only. As long as you say that this index, as long as you say that this is the main part. Like if you change this to app, yeah, nothing happens because it does not know like what's going on here. App is just a component. It doesn't tell it to render anywhere. And the index is telling to render this component on a root.
Oh, that part there. Okay.
This is the most important part that we need to have on a. That's also why usually in almost all the React applications there is an index and then there is an app, and the index is just for this logic, because right now you can say like there is like 4 lines of code. Why can't it be all in one? In the future, once we will have a little bit bigger tools, like if you need to connect to an API, all that logic goes here, because this will be the main entry point for the whole application. So this one will be responsible to tell the rest of the application that if you need data, this is the API to use. If you need something else, this is the API to use. So that's usually why, again, it's a convention, it's not required. It's just somebody started like that and it makes sense.
So why does it has an app.js in the first place, if it has index.js to begin with?
It's just so that to keep people away from polluting this one, basically. And you should do all your code outside of this one. Even though you can do your code here, but you should do it outside of here. And in here should only be to render it and pass more important, for instance, to load the styles, to do other things. But that's not a requirement. That's just whoever came up with it, everybody thought it seems cool. Let's use it like that. The only thing that it's really, really required is to have a public folder with an index. Because the React behind the scenes tries to find, if there is no index, then I don't know where to point to. I have no idea. That's a requirement. But the app.js is not.
About CSS files, normally we make many of them. We should import all in the index file, or you can import locally.
If you make many CSS files, it means that usually, you would make one per component.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Because if this component needs a special thing, then there is that. Then it should be imported on a component that is being used. So that, let's say you have all the CSS files somewhere else, and then I go here, and it's like, where is this blue coming from? You know, there should be an import here, like this blue comes from this.
So can you import one here?
Yeah, it's just because we are importing it on a main file. So, but in here we need to. Where is it? Styles.css. This is. Why did it? Oh, yeah, I need to change this index. Yeah. Where were we? Repository header, I think. Yeah, this is completely valid. It's just
why would two point?
because it's 2 folders up.
Yeah.
Because the header is inside of components, so it needs to go not 2, 1 folder up, and then it loads. But again, because we are actually loading it on an index, now it does not make sense. But this is also something we will improve later, because right now that's not really how you should write styles. But for now, this is what we are doing. But later we will see
So
otherwise.
like you mentioned, like each component I should create CS5 and import it inside that component.
Again, it depends how big your application is. For instance, if you have this application only, does not make sense to have one CSS file per component, because that would be too much files to handle just for that. But if you have a bigger application, then it makes sense to like divide and make it more accessible to that.
Marco, so the root of the tree is the app or the index?
Index.
The index.
Yeah, because the index is the one that renders. The app is the one that owns the components but doesn't render it. It just combines them, basically.
It's just like C#, when they have this public stake void something, where you run all the meters inside.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Now, just to finish, I will create a state here, like similar to what we have on GitHub, this star thing. So we will do this, use state. Not stat, star. Yeah. And now I will actually do a little bit different here. So, and oh, probably I need a constant. No. Do I need a constant? I should. Oh, actually, shouldn't this work? Yeah, it does. Okay, amazing. So now, for instance, before we had the map here and printing each component here. So if we want to add something to it, as I said before, like it's a bit dangerous because we are actually touching here, so we might break actually the parent. And this way gives us freedom to now change whatever we want on the repository, and it just gets duplicated everywhere. So now let's say we want a bar at the end of each one of them. And there you go. We change the component and it gets replicated everywhere. So it's really, really reusable. And that's basically what React also is about, is reusability. And I added this star button that on click, it goes one up. I just did it a little bit different. And I don't know if you guys did this before. On the other files, on an on-click event, I had the arrow function and then a set state or a set whatever I defined there with the values there. And as you saw sometimes, like it was weird because the code would become big, either vertical or horizontal. So you can always do this to clean up a little bit so that your code basically says on the button on click, call this function. Of course, if the function is not there, you get an error, so whatever. So the function is defined here, and the function does exactly the same that we would put here. It just, like it's an arrow function that has exactly the same properties, that basically gets whatever value is on star and adds one. So, and this adds star, which is the one from use state. And this also makes it so that you can always add more stuff to your handle button without messing up any visual on your code. Like your code still is really, really clean. It's almost HTML only here, and all your logic stays a little bit up here. Because, yeah.
I'm sorry. And the function can also be put outside of the repository
No.
function. It should be inside.
Yeah, this You mean this function, right?
Yes, yes.
No, the thing is that because this function is using this one that comes from the state, that all this logic needs to be here. Otherwise, if you want to put it outside, then you need to pass the state as parameters, and that can have some problems. I mean, it is possible to do, but again, it would not make much sense because again, you should not put logic here that it's completely outside of the
You
the
will
scope.
be mixing up scopes.
But
Yeah.
before you use set star as a function.
Yes.
Marco, you use the set star as a function itself.
Yes, because from use state, from this hook, you get the initial value on the left and the function on the right, always. Even if you would call this set, that wouldn't mean anything.
Yeah.
It's value on the left, function on the right, the use state. And this again, this makes the code very, very clean, but it might be a little bit tricky to understand what's happening behind the scenes.
Because like you call you create a new function, and inside that function you make the set star function.
Yeah, that's not really what's happening there.
That's what I see.
Yeah, but basically on the use state, what is happening is whatever you are sending here as a parameter
It's the start of the.
is the start of the value.
Yes.
And then it always returns a value and a function. And you can name those whatever you want.
Yes.
You can call it whatever you want. And this one is to update that one.
Yes, I understand. But why you don't like direct? You make set star like function, and it's like star plus one. You don't. Why you need the other function handle?
Oh, this one is just to clean this, because we can do this. It's the same code. That's exactly the same. And as you can see now, the handle button is not being used and still works as expected. It's just, again, imagine that you have some analytics and you need, every time someone clicks on a button, needs to call the analytics, right? That happens in every single website. So you need to add that on click. So then here you probably need to make a request to a server or something. So your code, your HTML code, becomes very polluted with a lot of JavaScript. I mean, again, it is okay to do that, but for a new person that looks at your code, won't understand what's happening there.
Okay.
And if you put it out here, for instance, imagine like it says update the state and console log, then you already need to put two functions here. Start. And again, this becomes a bit more ugly. That's basically it. I mean, that's one of the main reasons why you will see a lot of handle functions. Or, I mean, this way you can call it whatever you want as well, because it's your own function. But you will see this a lot because it's just to clean your HTML. Even though you can use JavaScript inside of it, but it makes sense to have it a bit cleaner.
Yes.
Yeah.
The part where const star set star equals use state is destructuring array, right?
Yeah. Yeah. That's also a thing you will learn later, but yes, that's exactly what it is.
We just use it on Node Big 4 too.
And just one thing,
Yeah, sure.
for the homework, there is this Create React app. I'll send you the link on a chat for it, of how you should install. But I also think you should not upload the Node modules for GitHub. I think you probably know that.
Yeah, we know
because
that.
that's a lot of things.
Yes, we know.
Okay.
We will add it on Git.